the energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, remains a figure of profound complexity and enduring fascination. Charismatic and ambitious, he inspired a nation to aim for the stars while facing the harsh realities of Cold War tensions. His presidency was marked by groundbreaking achievements, ushering in the era of civil rights and launching America's race to the moon, but also by glaring missteps, including the Bay of Pigs invasion that tested his resolve as a leader. Behind the polished public image lay personal struggles and controversies, from chronic health issues to clandestine affairs that challenged the ideals he professed. Yet, his ability to captivate hearts and minds made him a symbol of hope and possibility. Few presidents have been as lionized and are as iconoclastic as JFK. Many people are aware of his career during World War II and his command of the PT-109 in the Pacific, made famous by the film PT-109 starring actor Cliff Robertson playing Kennedy. His struggles with the Soviet Union during the early Cold War period, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many other events leading up to his assassination are also well known. But let's examine the details of JFK's presidential life, his controversies, and the deals that were made to keep his most egregious personal actions secret and out of the public view, which could have led to his impeachment. Who was John F. Kennedy? How did he possibly compromise national security? Why were some of his strategic decisions highly questionable? What backdoor deals did he and his brother Robert Kennedy make to hide the corruption? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts, the second of 9 children to parents Joseph and Rose Kennedy. His father, Joe Kennedy, was a successful businessman, especially during Prohibition, with his imports of whiskey, and was an early supporter of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who appointed him chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934. While Joe was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain in 1937, John, his son, also known as Jack, traveled to Europe as his father's secretary while he was a student at Harvard University. His senior thesis about Britain's unpreparedness for war was later published as an acclaimed book, Why England Slept, in 1940. Upon returning to the U.S., JFK started a relationship with Danish actress and sex symbol Inga Arvad, who had been a favorite of Adolf Hitler and was accepted into the dictator's inner circle. When Arvad immigrated to New York in 1940, she was already under FBI investigation for being a Nazi spy, given her ex-husband, Hungarian film director Paul Fajos's open support of the Nazis. She had married Fajos in 1935, and they both had a close relationship with Axel Wenner-Gren, who was a known Nazi supporter and financier. Arvad and JFK dated, and marriage was discussed, with Kennedy taking preliminary measures to have Arvad convert to Catholicism and have her 2 earlier marriages annulled. On January 17, 1942, FBI Assistant Director Milton Ladd reported to J. Edgar Hoover that there was nothing yet substantial to the rumors that Arvad was, in fact, a Nazi agent. Through Joe's influence, that relationship died a rather quick natural death, since JFK was stationed in the South Pacific. JFK's P-219 was sunk by a Japanese destroyer, and the event permanently injured his spine, which would give him chronic pain for the rest of his life. He was awarded the Navy Marine Corps Medal for his efforts to save his men. After World War II, JFK entered politics, won a seat in the House of Representatives as a moderately conservative Democrat in 1946. He won re-election to the House of Representatives in 1948 and 1950, and later to the U.S. Senate in 1953, defeating the Republican incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. JFK was tapped by his father to run for the presidency since his older brother, Joseph Kennedy, Jr., had been killed in 1944 on a bombing mission in Europe. His debate against Vice President Richard Nixon on live television increased his popularity to some degree, but Joseph Sr. was taking no chances. His old mob connections were contacted, and he had meetings with the biggest names of the day, such as Sam Giancana, Meyer Lansky, and others. J. Edgar Hoover and See Our Video on Him and the Justice Department had been cracking down hard on organized crime. Joe Kennedy made a deal with the mob that a Kennedy administration would lighten up on the mob, which helped establish the Kennedy fortune, and millions of votes were bought, the dead voted, and some cast multiple ballots in various locations. According to General Curtis E. LeMay, he said, "We all know that if it had not been for his father, Joseph, buying votes in Chicago and paying off and promising the mob great legal leniency and turning a blind eye to their criminal shit, there would have never been a Kennedy Camelot, let alone a Lyndon Lounge." He was, of course, referring to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Kennedy won the election with less than 120,000 out of some 70 million votes cast in the questionable election, becoming the youngest man and the first Roman Catholic to be elected President of the United States. In April 1961, after Fidel Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista, Kennedy approved the plan to send 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles in an amphibious landing at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba to overthrow Castro and the communists, which could have ended his presidency. This disaster was preventable. See our video on the Bay of Pigs. Again, as stated by General LeMay, well, the Ivy Leaguers decided to let the CIA plan one of the most screwed, hillbilly, bullshit black bag operations in history. Few plans can be labeled as failures the moment they are conceived, but to plan for a failure, know it will be a failure, and still execute it is beyond my comprehension. I sat in on the mission planning, and I agreed with the invasion of Cuba, but I could not believe the amateur hour shit that was going on with regard to how JFK and his Ivy League clowns were handling that. The Bay of Pigs fiasco was easy to see coming because there was no overt U.S. air support. That was too high profile. Then they planned on putting those Cuban exiles on the beach, and with no air support, it was a suicide mission. I felt like I was dreaming. Who were these people? I'll bet that if their son was going to hit that beach, their ass would have had air cover, and I offered it. The official story to cover JFK's ass was that he was fed bad intel and given bad military advice. Bullshit. I was there. But the Cuban Missile Crisis soon reached critical mass, as stated again by LeMay. Kennedy had to be reached by phone later at night because we had the U-2 pictures later proving that Soviet SAMs were in Cuba along with ships offloading MiG fighters. There was no answer on his phone, but they somehow managed to track him through the Secret Service detail to a hotel where he was doing this chick who was married to a friend of his. The crisis was resolved with removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey and other sites close to Soviet borders. LeMay said, "In the end, the Russians agreed to remove the missiles if we made concessions in Europe, and the deal was done." In July 1963, Kennedy won his greatest foreign affairs victory when Khrushchev agreed to join him and Britain's Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in signing a nuclear test ban treaty. In September 1963, the Senate approved his atmospheric test ban treaty, and this ended above-ground nuclear testing for both the Soviet Union and the United States. This was hailed as one of the most remarkable achievements in U.S. diplomatic history. Kennedy took an additional diplomatic step when, in October 1963, he authorized the sale of American wheat to the Soviets to help them cope with a poor harvest to avoid starvation. JFK had managed to melt some of the political ice with the USSR. JFK's brother Robert Kennedy was appointed as U.S. Attorney General, while the youngest Kennedy son, Edward, known as Ted, took his older brother's former seat in 1962 in the Senate. Bobby Kennedy would become intertwined in the chaos that followed. Kennedy's desire to curb the spread of communism saw him escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam, giving political support, humanitarian aid, and U.S. military and civilian advisors, although privately he expressed his dismay over the situation. To his credit, Kennedy did not want full-blown American military involvement, which he believed would undermine his progress with the Soviet Union and ignite another hotspot. But JFK was very industrious and created legislation and executive action that led to the eventual passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 under Lyndon B. Johnson, and see our video on him, as well as supporting NASA and Project Apollo with his vision of putting a man on the moon. He created the Peace Corps and established the Military Special Operations Forces, primarily the U.S. Navy SEALs and U.S. Army Special Forces. JFK had also created the Interdepartmental Committee on the Status of Women and the Citizens Advisory Council on the Status of Women, which helped usher in the modern women's rights movement. Kennedy's New Frontier agenda also included the Equal Pay Act, which he signed into law in June 1963, which addressed the elimination of pay inequities based upon gender. In practice, it had negligible effect in most economic sectors until strengthened by court decisions in the 1970s and additional congressional actions under later presidential administrations. Otherwise, Kennedy's actions produced few advances for women in politics or government. For example, in his cabinet, it did not include a single woman, and he was certainly no feminist in his professional or private life. But JFK was having a lot of problems in his private life that would endanger his presidency, if not his life. His brother, the Attorney General, threw the full weight of the Department of Justice at the very mobsters their father had made a deal with, and it would only get worse. The Kennedys were always at odds with the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who openly hated them both, and the feeling was mutual. Soon, Hoover would have a trump card that he wielded to his advantage. Many people are aware that JFK had multiple affairs during his marriage to Jackie Kennedy, but few know the darker side of his presidency. But his affair with a communist spy was a real problem. That woman was Bertha Hildegard Ellie Romesch, assigned to the West German Embassy in Washington, D.C., as she was married to West German Sergeant Rolf Romesch, who himself was assigned to the German Logistics Office in Washington with their young son. Romesch, who was born and had worked in East Germany, also worked as a fashion model under the name Ellen and was just one of many of JFK's mistresses. Some journalists, such as Clark R. Mollenhoff of the Des Moines Register, took note. If exposed, the Kennedy-Romesch affair could have become a major national security issue. What raised eyebrows was that she was living a lifestyle far beyond her husband's pay grade, and astonishingly so, and she made her way through many members of the House and Senate before getting to the Kennedys as a well-known call girl. On July 12, 1963, Romesch was interviewed by the FBI. The official story is that the FBI never turned up any solid evidence that she was, in fact, a spy or that she had relations with Kennedy. This was because Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had his thumb on the scale, but he was informed of the investigation on July 3, 1963. However, the FBI finding contradicted the Secret Service and CIA investigations. They had information from informants and phone taps that proved otherwise, while Romesch worked at the Quorum Club, a member-only club at the Carroll Arms Hotel on Capitol Hill, adjacent to a Senate office building. The Quorum Club was established by Senate aide Bobby Baker, who became Romech's pimp, and he had close ties with Lyndon Johnson. This club was exclusive, members only, and created for high-ranking politicos to socialize and where they met their mistresses in a controlled social environment out of public view of the press. JFK and Ellen Romech met there quite often. The State Department was also concerned when they were given all the reports, with the FBI report being the only one that absolved Ellen Romech of espionage or, at the very least, questionable acts and contacts, such as her former boss in East German intelligence. In July 1963, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover informed Bobby Kennedy that, despite the official FBI report, he knew full well about the president's relationship with Romech, who was described in bureau files as a prostitute. Hoover also dropped her file with her background investigation. She was described as a German lady about town who sometimes visited the Quorum Club and met with Jack Kennedy at his request. Bobby Kennedy, through the State Department, couldn't get her out of the States fast enough when the newspapers revealed that Romech also had an affair with a Russian diplomat. Historian Michael Beschloss says Hoover told Bobby Kennedy, "We have information that not only your brother, the president, but others in Washington have been involved with a woman whom we suspect as a Soviet intelligence agent, someone who is linked to East German intelligence." Robert Kennedy then used all his powers as Attorney General with the help of J. Edgar Hoover to quash investigations by the Congress and the FBI, according to Seymour Hersh in The Dark Side of Camelot. Panic gripped the White House when the president learned what the FBI had uncovered. Romech and her husband were hastily flown back to Germany on the U.S. Air Force transport plane at the behest of the State Department. According to Seymour Hersh, Ellen, Rolfe, and their son were accompanied by Laverne Duffy, one of Bobby Kennedy's colleagues from his days on the McClellan Committee. Records related to Romech's deportation have either vanished or were never created in the first place to help preserve the secrecy. No sooner than the plane took off, Bobby Kennedy met privately with Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield and his Republican counterpart, Everett Dirksen, asking them to keep to themselves whatever they knew of the Romech matter. Bobby Kennedy then sent J. Edgar Hoover to Capitol Hill with a not-so-friendly word to the wise. "Don't investigate this," Hoover told Republicans, "because if you do, we're going to open up everybody's closets." J. Edgar Hoover, as every Republican knew, held the key to a lot of closets and was familiar with what was in all of them. The Senate leaders kept the secret about what they knew, as did Hoover, but at a high price. Hoover knew that JFK had paid Romech large payments in Deutschmarks to help her remember to keep her mouth shut. He had the records. Despite being political enemies, both JFK and RFK knew that Hoover was the only one who could help them with the cover-up, because he had files on the sexual escapades of everyone who was anyone in Washington, including dozens of senators. But Hoover would bail out the president only on two conditions. First, JFK would never fire him, and second, the FBI could escalate its bugging of Martin Luther King Jr. and others, and RFK would not interfere with his COINTELPRO operation. That is also in our video on J. Edgar Hoover. The Kennedys agreed, and Hoover showed Senate leaders the FBI sex files on dozens of senators. The FBI director explained that if the Senate exposed the president's sex life, no one would be safe. Ironically, that same day, the Senate leaders announced that there would be no investigation into Ellen Romech. Days later, speaking to his friend Ben Bradley about Hoover, JFK said, "Boy, the dirt he has on those senators, you wouldn't believe it." Former Secret Service agent Larry Newman remembered the morale problems that the president's indiscretions caused among his fellow Secret Service agents. To quote him, "You were on the most elite assignment in the Secret Service, and you were there watching an elevator or a door because the president was inside with two hookers. It just didn't compute. Your neighbors and everybody thought you were risking your life. and you are actually out there to see that he's not disturbed while he's having an interlude in the shower with two gals from 12th Avenue. Newman also remembered joking with his colleagues about which one of them would testify on Capitol Hill if and when the president received harm or was killed in the room by these two women. Kennedy had affairs with scores of other women, including two White House interns named Fiddle and Faddle. Pamela Turner, who was Jackie's personal secretary, who was hired at the request of JFK, was one. Another one was Mary Meyer, a prominent Georgetown artist who was the niece of Guilford Pinchot, the conservationist and Teddy Roosevelt's chief forester. JFK and RFK also had affairs with Marilyn Monroe, although Kennedy's strongest supporters have denied the relationship, while insiders were well aware of the incidents, as was J. Edgar Hoover. Again, according to General Curtis E. LeMay, yes, I know all about Marilyn Monroe and about 40 others, including Phyllis McGuire. Sam Giancana would not have taken well to Kennedy screwing two of his women, especially McGuire. One Secret Service agent who was a former Air Force type who lost a brother in Korea told me that he knew personally that Brother Bobby shared both women with his older brother. Once he was aware of the threesomes with Marilyn, some moral compasses they had. People wonder about the assassination of JFK. I say look to the mob, because he no sooner took the oath of office than his brother began getting federal indictments against the very men who stole the election for him. One well-supported story is that of Mimi Beardsley, a 19-year-old White House intern at the time of her involvement with JFK, just 4 days into her job. Beardsley, whose later married name was Alford, lost her virginity to Kennedy as he conducted what can only be called a deeply inappropriate affair with a young charge. It even included a Kennedy-directed episode of oral sex with aide Dave Powers while JFK watched. Beardsley Alford's actions with JFK were well known to the White House staff as she traveled to and from locations where JFK was. This activity caused some in government to question Kennedy's basic fitness for the highest office. Any private citizen or politician would have been condemned for such activities, such as Bill Clinton, and as president, JFK risked his presidency, the welfare of his party, his policy goals, and everyone he supposedly held dear. His wife Jackie was well aware of these activities. The late Robert Pierpoint, the White House correspondent for CBS television during the Kennedy years, once recalled an episode that revealed Mrs. Kennedy's matter-of-fact acceptance of JFK's bold unfaithfulness. To quote him, "I was sitting in the White House press room one day shortly after noon, and through the corridor came a French magazine correspondent who worked for Paris Match, and he said, 'Bob, I've just had a very unusual experience. I have to tell somebody about it.' He was somewhat agitated and said that he had been invited to have lunch with Jackie upstairs in the private area and the president joined them. And then, after lunch, the president said, 'Jackie, why don't you show our friend around?' She did and brought him over to the West Wing. Between the cabinet room and the Oval Office, there is a small room where the secretaries sit. As she ushered him into that room, she said in French, 'And there is the woman that my husband is supposedly sleeping with.' He was quite upset and didn't know what to answer. It was kind of embarrassing for him. Jackie was in fact referring to Mimi Beardsley Alford, who later married Dick Alford in 2005 and wrote her memoir, Once Upon a Secret, My Affair with President John F. Kennedy and Its Aftermath, which details her affair with Kennedy from June 1962 to November 1963. Female White House staffers were always available to JFK, such as the aforementioned Pamela Turner, Jackie Kennedy's appointment secretary, White House press aide Priscilla Weiss, codenamed Fiddle by the Secret Service, and press aide Jill Cowan, codenamed Faddle. JFK frequently romped with Fiddle and Faddle as a nude threesome in the White House swimming pool. Then there was his favorite Georgetown mistress, Mary Pinchot Meyer, who made about 30 visits to the White House between the months of January 1962 and November 1963 whenever Jackie was out of town. Then there was aspiring movie actress Judith Exner Campbell, who was introduced to JFK by his good friend Frank Sinatra, who also had a long-lasting relationship with her and she made at least 20 visits to the White House, again when Jackie was out of town. Campbell eventually confessed that the president's persistent back pain eventually made their lovemaking rather perfunctory and one-dimensional. Writing in her book, My Story, Campbell said, "Kennedy was always on his back, and the feeling that I was there to service him began to really trouble me." Campbell was also one of Chicago Mafia boss Sam Giancana's girlfriends. JFK, along with RFK, was creating a powerful enemy. Having reneged on the hands-off policy regarding mob activities by RFK, now JFK was interjecting himself into Giancana's personal life. Other Hollywood celebrities JFK entertained included actresses Jane Mansfield, Cam Novak, Audrey Hepburn, Jean Tierney, Angie Dickinson, burlesque queens Blaze Starr and Tempest Storm, and of course, Phyllis McGuire of the famous McGuire sisters. A longtime close friend of the president, former Senator George Smathers of Florida, once asserted, "There's no question about the fact that Jack had the most active libido of any man I've ever known, and he got more so the longer he was married." So, the public perception of JFK was sterilized by the FBI and Hoover, as well as senators from both parties and a compliant media who knew of these events but never widely reported on them, either by the respect for the office or for fear of retribution. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was killed on November 22, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, but that is another story. Many theories have arisen. Was his murder an inside government hit? Was it the mob taking its revenge? Was it Castro and the communists? Perhaps one day when the files are declassified and made public, we will know. Kennedy's death has spawned perhaps the greatest collection of conspiracy theories in U.S. history. Some believe it was Sam Giancana and the mob. Others, like prosecutor Jim Garrison, believed that anti-communist and anti-Castro extremists in the CIA plotted the assassination of Kennedy to maintain tension with the Soviet Union and Cuba and to prevent a United States withdrawal from Vietnam. And then many believed that Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and see our video on him, wanted Kennedy dead to increase the U.S. presence in Vietnam and become president. Regardless, JFK seems to be the kind of guy that all men wanted to be, a man some wanted to kill, and a man to whom women were as easily obtainable as loose pocket change. What we do know is that JFK was one hell of a guy with the opposite sex. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.